Welcome, dear participants, to this webinar on socio-economic implications of the COVID-19 pandemic on developing countries and the role of South-South and triangular cooperation. This is a webinar organized jointly by United Nations Office for South-South Cooperation and UNDP Seoul Policy Center. My name is Grace Wang. I'm the Deputy Director of UNOSSC for South-South Cooperation, and I'm happy to be the moderator of the webinar today. So I would like to remind participants that I would like to encourage you to use the chat function for contributing questions. We cannot take live questions this time, but your questions typed into the chat box, we will definitely try to address them. And the audience can only communicate with the panelists by using the chat box function. This webinar will be recorded and it will be later shared on the South-South Global Thinkers platform and also the South-South Galaxy platform. So the content will be available to you, and we welcome you to widely disseminate with your networks. Colleagues, we all know that COVID-19 has spread to more than 182 countries and territories, which is overwhelming for the world, not only on health sectors, but also it has significant economic and social impact. So it will burden societies for years to come, especially developing countries, on their journey towards ending poverty. Many people in the global south could be facing financial crisis, loss of jobs, food insecurity, education, and other challenges, which will increase their likelihood of, and also likelihood of falling back into poverty. This would require actions urgently, including both immediate responses and early recovery efforts to mitigate the impact of the pandemic. Government needs to put on a complex mix of health, social protection, economic, financial measures to avoid erasing all the development gains that we have achieved around the world. At this critical point of the time, we feel South-South knowledge sharing is even more critical, not only saving lives, but also helping us to prepare for a better future. So this is the time for developing countries to come together to share knowledge and also involving developed countries for global collaboration. At UNOSSC, we are actively sharing and promoting knowledge, lessons learned, and research to support governments and countries to address this crisis, including utilizing the South-South Global Thinkers Network, which is a joint UNOSSC and UNDP initiative that pulled over 6 major think tank networks across all regions, over 250 think tanks from the global south. On this network, we have found that our researchers are so active. We have already collected and shared over 40 articles and research pieces on the South-South Global Thinkers online platform, and this compendium will keep expanding and widely shared. The objective is really to have those evidence-based research to inform policy making. And we're also utilizing webinars like this one to promote sharing of ideas and insights. So today we're very delighted to present to you distinguished researchers from Argentina, Nigeria, and Sri Lanka, who are members of the South-South Global Thinkers to present their country and regional insights and perspectives on the social and economic impact of COVID-19. What socio-economic measures that have been put in place or should be put in place by governments, the role of South-South and triangular cooperation in mitigating those risks. Additionally, we will also hear insights and perspectives shared by UNDP on the impact of COVID-19 and what it will have on the SDGs, what policies countries should put in place to further mitigate its impact. In this distinguished panel, we are very honored to have Mr. Jorge Chediak, Director of UN Office for South-South Cooperation and Envoy of the UN Secretary General on South-South Cooperation. We're very honored to have Mr. Stefan Klinkerbiel, Director of UNDP Seoul Policy Center. So before we invite the panel to present, let's welcome Mr. Chediak to provide opening remarks. Mr. Chediak, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Grace. Thank you, Stefan, for co-sponsoring this webinar. Thank you very much to all the panelists. And we really need to exchange information and practices about how to confront this challenge, because this is absolutely unprecedented. Every day we face new pieces of information that show how different the effects of the pandemic are to any recent phenomenon. There's nothing probably for a century that compares in the speed and the socio-economic and sanitary impact that this pandemic is having on the world. ILO estimates that over 300 million jobs are going to be lost by the second quarter of this year. 1.6 billion informal workers would be severely affected by this pandemic. WFP, the World Food Program, estimates that the people with under starvation will double by the end of this year. So we really have to confront this in an unprecedented way. Unprecedented meaning that we'll have to deploy some instruments of public policy, some instruments of economic policy, and some instruments of financial policies that were totally out of the toolbox even 3 or 4 months ago. And in that context, it is very important that we share this type of responses, because the effects of this pandemic are massive and immediate. So if countries in the Global South found responses that can be applicable to other countries of the Global South, sharing those experiences and making them available to policymakers is urgent, and time becomes a matter of the essence. So we have several dimensions. One is this one we're going to confront today and discuss today in the seminar. The other is the sanitary and epidemiological. We're going to participate in an event later today with the Director General of WHO in an event organized by the Brazil-Africa Forum. But we also have to start working on some of the effects that the pandemic will have on other structural matters. Finance and debt. There have been some generous initiatives from the IMF, the World Bank, and other multilateral banks to suspend for some very poor countries the services for a period of 6 months. But this is not debt forgiveness. This is not a reprieve. And based on the emerging patterns of trade and investment, both of which the UNCTAD estimates will fall down dramatically in the upcoming years, the issue of sustainability of the debt is really very serious, and will become a serious matter very soon, immediately after we raise our heads from the structural, from the serious problem we're confronting today. Also, investment that has been so critical in promoting the integration of the world economy. UNCTAD also estimates it will fall by half this year. Absolutely unprecedented. And we're talking foreign direct investment, but also domestic investment, because investment will fall because of the fall of demand and the chaos in the financial markets. So we are in a way consuming some of the global capital. And in the global south, the problem is more serious. Also, trade. Trade will fall in terms of volume massively this year for obvious reasons, fall of demand, etc. But we also have to consider for the medium term that some trade partners might change for good. There is a massive call in many countries to shorten and compress the global supply chains. And that will probably be achieved either through trade diversion or the reestablishment of productive facilities in central countries, which will, in a way, also reduce the volume of trade and the opportunities trade generates for many countries to develop themselves. So today we're going to exchange information on how to deal with the urgent response. But we also have to take into consideration how the urgent responses assist with dealing with some of the structural issues. I look forward to discussing in future events, and I would like also some of the presenters to give us some perspectives of how they see some of the structural problems today, because we really need the South to work together in addressing many of these issues, and also to working with our partners in the Northern Hemisphere, in the developed countries, the traditional developed countries, in building the new multilateral alliance that our Secretary General is calling for. Because my final word is, we should not let the pandemic be a vehicle by which multilateralism was weakened or even destroyed. And believe me, it is at risk. So we have to find ways to make it relevant and to make it effective to improving the quality of lives of the people of the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chatiak, for this very important remarks and also inspiring questions for the panel already. So let's now hear from different perspectives, different countries' experiences on the impact of socio-economic impact of the pandemic. I would like to encourage the panelists to stick to 8 to 10 minutes. We have Yasmin to help us to keep the time so that we leave time also for interaction. Let me first introduce our first speaker, Ms. Gala Diaz-Lango. She is the Social Protection Director at the Center for the Implementation of Public Policies for Equity and Growth, CIPPEC, in Argentina. And her work is focused on doing applied research on policies that foster women's and children's rights. She has authored over 50 publications on social policy in Latin America, and most recently a book on gender and labor in Argentina. She has also been actively publishing on social protection issues in Argentina in relation to this pandemic. And she will share her experience and her insights. Thank you very much, Gala. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Grace, so much for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation to take place in such a wonderful event discussing so important issues. In Argentina, the situation was already difficult before the pandemic hit. We had almost 40% of the population under the poverty line. Many of them were under a chronic situation of poverty that had proved to be a threshold very hard to puncture for the last 25 years or 30 years. 25% of the population has constantly been under poverty in Argentina. And the families that experience poverty are mostly the same in terms of their structure. There are families that have children, families that are mostly single parents and mostly single mothers. These types of families are overrepresented in poverty, and they are also mostly hit by the pandemic. There was another important group that were those that are in a social situation of vulnerability, that had informal works, that had temporary contracts. And those families are also experiencing increased difficulties these times. The COVID-19 widens these previous inequalities through two main channels that in a certain way highlight how the COVID poses an increased difficulty regarding the solving of structural problems that Mr. Chediek was mentioning. The two channels are, first, what happens in the market, in the labor market. The current situation of social isolation and telework or working remotely for those who have a possibility widens who gets what from the labor market, because those who can do remote work are those with higher qualifications, with higher incomes, and mostly men. There are also sectors that are doing better, and that those are also the ones with higher qualification workers and workers with higher incomes. The ones who get the lower hand in this pandemic are the informal workers, the domestic workers, the ones with temporary contracts, etc., that are mostly lower income. So these inequalities are being widened in the labor market. The second channel that through which the COVID-19 widens these inequalities is what happens at home. The suspension of classes, of education, and puts even more weight on the tension between paid and unpaid work within households. And this is specifically important for female-headed households or single mother households, which were already overrepresented in poverty in Argentina. So it is important to understand that in Argentina, the population under sanitary risk, those that are over 65 years old or have special pathologies, differ from those who are under social risk, who will experiment with an increased weight the impacts, the economic and social impacts of the pandemic. What have been the policies that the government has put in place? Well, it is important to acknowledge the starting point. We had a strengthened social protection system. Argentina, through the last 20 years, has been strengthening the social protection system. So we had quite a strong starting point. From there, two types of policies were implemented. First, the sanitary policies, which was a strict mandatory social isolation from the very beginning, which is quite a success story because the curve in Argentina has been indeed flattened. But this meant the suspension of classes, the interruption of economic activity, but also allowed the preparation of the health system with enough time to respond to the emergency. The second type of policies that were implemented are the policies to mitigate the impacts of the sanitary strategy, namely exceptional transferences for families under poverty, such as an emergency income for families who have children, alimentary cards to buy food, additional bonuses for some workers, etc. There has also been implemented special facilities for companies and small and medium enterprises, such as special credits, postergation of certain deadlines, etc. There has been price regulation also of essential goods and services. And two particular issues I would like to highlight. First, the issue of violence against women, which has been recorded to experience a peak with the isolation. There's a huge challenge to respond to that. There has been WhatsApp lines that have been receiving increased cases, but it is hard for the state to answer to that. The second issue I would like to highlight is domestic workers. In Argentina, all workers were issued a paid leave during the quarantine, but since domestic workers are mostly under informal contracts, 3 out of 4 domestic workers are in informality, it is hard to enforce this paid leave and to make sure that they receive it. Even those who want to pay the domestic workers who work on the households, it is quite difficult because they aren't always in the financial system and it's hard to make transferences. In short, the answer to COVID was built upon the previous strength of Argentina's social protection system, but it also replicates its biases. It reaches mostly the families that were already incorporated in the social protection systems, and it leaves aside certain populations, namely the informal. But this has allowed a rapid implementation and a timely answer. 3 challenges remain. First, targeting and satisfying the needs of households under social risk. This means mostly implementation of care policies. There is a dilemma between a strict sanitary strategy that has been implemented and the socialization of care through the opening or reopening of care facilities and education. The second challenge is sufficiency. All these in transferences, exceptional transferences that have been put in place aren't necessarily putting families above the poverty line. And the other challenge regarding sufficiency is the duration of those transferences. For now, they have been monthly, but it isn't certain that they will continue to be so. And the third challenge is coverage. There's a difficulty in reaching all vulnerable households, especially those that were previously excluded from the social protection system. From CPEC, we understand that there's an important role of the South-South cooperation in facing these challenges.
2 minutes remaining.
Thank you. This is a truly global challenge. It hit first in high-income countries, and this brings a great opportunity to learn from those experiences. However, we all know that southern countries have particular challenge, and those lessons are necessarily adaptable to our context. This is why South-South and triangular cooperation has an incredible added value. Countries with different starting points and different impacts can bring lessons on how to face the same challenge. In social policies, which is my specialty, this crisis is also an opportunity to rethink how we protect ourselves. Today, no one questions that access to health is a universal right. Access to social protection is also being discussed. It is a huge opportunity to define in each country how and what type of social protection we'd like to have, whether it is actually a right and therefore should be separated from the category we have in the labor market, and if policies such as the universal basic income are feasible. This discussion should go hand in hand with another debate regarding our tax systems and how regressive or progressive our fiscal structures are. Today, uncertainty reigns regarding the measures that will be implemented in the short and medium terms, but also regarding the long-term effects of this pandemic. One thing is known: many people will fall into poverty. The concept note that was shared for this event stated that, according to the World Economic Outlook, the COVID-19 pandemic will push 49 million people into extreme poverty by the end of this year. We are leading towards a humanitarian crisis. How we face it is up to us. The political will regarding the implementation of strong social policies and particularly strong social protection floors is the key to prevent it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Carla, for sharing these very important insights, and thank you for highlighting those that we need to pay special attention that are impacted by the pandemic, especially your highlight on women and children, and not only economic challenges, but also social risks they're bearing, violence against women, domestic workers situation. So this is very much in line with what we wanted to do through this sharing, that we hope we can recommend and inspire policymakers and practitioners to really put upfront, leaving no one behind as the principle of our measures taken. And thank you for the targeting, sufficiency, and coverage challenges that you have shared with us. It feels like through what you have talked about the already measures put in place, we are facing an opportunity in history. It's like pressing down this fast forward button for a lot of progresses that we could put in place and how to sustain them. So thank you very much, and welcome the young participants as well to the webinar. Yeah, very good. Yay, So now, thank you very much, Carla. I know there will be questions later on, but now let me welcome our second speaker, Mr. Kismina Hevic. He is a research economist at the Institute of Policy Studies, IPS, and a member of the World Economic Forum's Expert Network. He recently authored the article, A Brewing Storm, Economic Impact of COVID-19 on Sri Lanka. So let's welcome Kismina to share insights from Sri Lanka.
Thank you, Grace, and thank you to the organizers for having me at this webinar today. I come from an economics background, so my intervention will be slightly catered and kind of coming from that perspective. Sri Lanka's position as of right now is slightly contentious due to two reasons. One is because we have been under a strict curfew where there have been restrictions on travel and economic activity like all other countries for the past 7 weeks or so. So there has been effectively a stall in economic activity in the country. And similar to Argentina, there have been knock-on effects on the socio-economic factors, mainly in terms of the informal sector and daily wage earners, for example, have been hit hard. There are other sectors such as the SMEs, small and medium enterprises, who have pretty much lost all sources of income over the past 7 weeks. And the fact that they tend to have very little savings means that it's we don't necessarily know if they can survive long enough beyond the curfew and be able to kind of sustain the operations once curfew is lifted and once the economy restarts again. Thirdly, we expect a medium to long term, a short term and medium term impact on some critical sectors to the Sri Lankan economy, namely the tourism sector and the export, particularly in garment sector. Now, why tourism is obvious, because there are undoubtedly going to be restrictions on travel. There will be restrictions on incoming travel in Sri Lanka, but also in terms of global restrictions in travel, probably, and I think experts say that probably until at least some form of vaccine to COVID-19 is found. So there are undoubtedly going to be impacts on that. And unfortunately for Sri Lanka, the tourism sector is still reeling from last year's Easter Sunday attack. So this year, 2020, was supposed to be the year that it was going to recover from that attack, and 2020 moving on to 2021. So unfortunately, that period is now going to be prolonged even further. And not only will it affect the formal tourism sector, but it will also affect the informal workers, the informal sector that depends on the tourism sector. So this is something that the government and I think policymakers will have to focus on. Thirdly, in terms of the export sector, in terms of garments, we are already seeing, I think, close to 30 million unemployed numbers in the US, and the Sri Lankan export sector is dependent on the EU and the US for the export markets. So a possible global recession over the next quarter or so will undoubtedly have an impact on demand for our exports, but also in terms of the lockdowns that are happening around the world, there will be a disruption of supply chains as well. So this is going to have an impact on the export sector, and a vast majority of those employed in export garments, for example, in the garment sector, are females. So the unemployment or the economic impact of this is going to be disproportionately felt by female workers in these sectors. So this is something that we need to kind of take into consideration as well. Overall, unfortunately, the Sri Lankan system is twofold, like I said. One is, even though numerically, we have, I think, close to around 700 active cases of COVID-19 right now, and I think 9 deaths, which may seem low compared to most of the countries. However, the country hasn't implemented broad testing. So we don't necessarily know the extent to which the country is facing the current situation right now. Testing, or at least community testing, has taken place in certain clusters. So as the country looks towards opening up economic activity, already some districts have opened up, but Colombo and some of the main districts where the economic activity tends to centralize is still under curfew because they are deemed to be high-risk areas. So the potential of a second wave of attacks, if we open up the economy too early, is going to be devastating to the economy, and in addition, devastating to the public health sector. So far, the country has done well because we do tend to have a relatively strong public health sector because we have universal healthcare and so on. However, a second wave of these cases will be problematic to the country. The second factor that kind of underpins this entire issue with Sri Lanka is a macroeconomic situation. I'm sure you've all read, and kind of it's well reported in regards to Sri Lanka's debt situation. And we are expected to pay a record amount of debt repayment commitments over the next 2 to 3 years, particularly in terms of interest repayments. In addition, the government deficit has also been increasing in recent years. As a result, the fiscal space that the government has to provide a stimulus package for the economy in the short term is quite narrow. And that's going to be a problem, particularly because, as my colleague from Argentina just said, there has been some kind of move by several governments in developing countries to provide some fiscal stimulus for SMEs as well as other corporations to sustain themselves and to kind of re-emerge from the situation in the short to medium term. So the fiscal space for Sri Lanka is very narrow, and that's going to be an area of concern for the government in the short term, particularly from fiscal as well as debt obligation wise. So what the government has done so far is, in addition to kind of the curfew that I already spoke, has focused mainly on sort of monetary policy. They've reduced interest rates. They've provided debt moratoriums for domestic loan repayments and some concessionary loans. They passed on the burden somewhat to the banking sector to provide concessionary loans at a subsidized interest rate. So these are all kind of monetary policy based activity. Whether these will be successful in actually stimulating the economy is questionable, and it has to be seen. Now, this next thing that I wanted to kind of touch on is, for example, even though Sri Lanka's poverty rate is close to around 2%, so if you look at multidimensional poverty, it's about 1.9% overall. If you look at near multidimensional poverty, so those who are at the margins of the poverty line, there are close to 500,000 citizens, persons who are close to that. And these are the people who are most at risk and also unlikely to be covered by the sort of policies that are catered towards people who are already within or fall within the social security net, because they just are above the multidimensional poverty line, and they are also at the most risk of falling back under the poverty line because of this situation, because many of them work in the informal sector or kind of in the retail sector, that is one of the sectors that is being affected most. So these are the kind of the broader broader kind of socio-economic factors that I want to touch on, and I'll kind of detail these more when it comes to the Q&A session.
2 minutes remaining.
Sure. In terms of the role that South-South cooperation can take, I think the first point that I want to make is that it's clear, particularly during this crisis, that traditional means of cooperation or a global response has been absent during this crisis. Countries have been kind of taking individual action to try and curb the situation. At least, I mean, for example, during the 2008 financial crisis, we saw a global response to try and minimize the effects of this. However, we are seeing for quite a few populist nationalist countries. I think we all know who the culprits are, who tend to, and there is an absence of a global response in terms of this situation, which means that traditional means of North-South cooperation may not be available to the extent that countries are used to. So there is an added responsibility for South-South cooperation to kind of plug that gap that might be created when developed countries may have their own problems to deal with over the next couple of months or years due to the recessions or the recessions that they may face. So that is one thing that I want to. The next thing is in terms of debt. So particularly from Sri Lanka's perspective, close to around 20% of our total debt comes from bilateral lenders, so namely India and China, who are our South-South partners. So some form of debt relief through as a means of South-South cooperation, for example, might be beneficial for Sri Lanka overall. So this has to be through diplomatic means and other means and economic means that may have to happen at the South-South level. And thirdly, in terms of knowledge sharing, and I think this is where triangular cooperation is most important, in terms of knowledge sharing in regards to best practices in terms of reopening the economy, whilst conducting the right sort of testing capacity, because obviously Sri Lanka is not in a position to test at the levels of maybe, let's say, South Korea. There has to be some sort of balance that has to be struck from a developing country perspective that has limited capacity. So those are three kind of areas that I want to touch on, and I'll be more than happy to develop them even further during the Q&A session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kitmina. In your talk, we already find three very important questions you're raising, and those are all very tricky questions. It seems to present to policymakers and development practitioners dilemmas out there. Like, we need to recover on economic front, but too early returning to some of the economic activities will impact the containment effect for the pandemic. So is there a policy choice? Is there a balance to strike? Or is there an absolute priority that we need to follow? So that's a very important and challenging question. Also, you mentioned monetary policies that are using by a country and that are using by other countries as well, but will that stimulate economy? A question to ponder as well. Those people who are at the edge of falling down the cliff of poverty, what should we do on this? So you're calling for more South-South cooperation in a world that most needs cooperation. Now that there is a question online that you have partly addressed it, but you might want to elaborate later on during the question and answer session. The question is, with the global move to restrict trade, how important it is for promoting South-South investment and trade policies? Yeah, so there is a related question. Just want to flag it early on. Now I have the pleasure to introduce the third speaker, Mr. Chuka Ongyakunya. He is the Executive Director of the Center for the Study of the Economies of Africa, CSEA, in Nigeria. Dr. Ongyakunya is a member of the steering committee of the West African Think Tank Network and the Global Economic Governance Africa. He recently authored the article, The Case for Debt Relief in Africa Amid COVID-19. He will share insights from Nigeria and from Africa as well. So I think, Chuka, you will use PPT, right?
Yes, I will.
Okay, yeah, Chuka, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'll just share my screen. So thank you very much, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. I'm happy to be in this very important webinar. COVID-19 pandemic has been one of the biggest challenges we had, in a lifetime for some people. And we have seen that, we need some kind of collaborative effort to solve this challenge. And platforms like the South Corporation, can offer that kind of, can be one of the bases as which we can, collectively solve this kind of unprecedented challenge. So I'm happy to be here and to do this kind of presentation on the social and economic impact of COVID-19 outbreak in Nigeria and Africa broadly. This is like an outline of my presentation. I'll touch on the background and some of the socio-economic policy responses, and also the implications, the socio-economic implications, as well as the role of South-South cooperation and triangular cooperation in mitigating against the risks. And then I'll make some concluding remarks. So I'll start by mentioning in particular that Africa as a continent had very strong existing vulnerabilities even before the crisis. Despite Africa experiencing a growth of up to 3.4% in 2019, the growth it was experiencing was largely not inclusive, experiencing non-inclusive growth. And what that means is that despite having GDP growth, it was having very strong socioeconomic challenges. And we call this the triple socioeconomic challenges, consisting of poverty, high unemployment, and also inequality. However, on the positive side, regions like the West Africa, largely, have dealt with some, pandemics, outbreaks, not pandemics, of infectious disease in the recent past, such as the Ebola outbreak, polio, and Lassa fever. But despite this experience in dealing with these infectious diseases, the region has the weakest health infrastructure in the world, with very unimpressive rankings in terms of WHO rankings of health infrastructure. So the continent met this this pandemic at a very vulnerable position. So in terms of Africa, as of May 6th, Africa recorded about 49,000, about 50,000 cases and about 2,000 deaths. The Northern African region was worse hit, while Central Africa less hit. Nigeria, it's on about 3,000 cases. Today, it's about 103 deaths. I must mention that this relatively lower number of cases globally might not really reflect that this is not very severe in the continent. This relatively lower number of cases might partly reflect that the testing has been really low, because the resources for testing and tracing has been quite scarce in the region. So in line with other countries, most African countries impose lockdown measures to stem the spread of the virus. However, recently, within the last 2 weeks, countries like Nigeria, South Africa, and Ghana have begun to ease the lockdown in order to resume economic activities. So they've, in line with other countries, they face the trade-off of, safeguarding the economy, and public health considerations. And I will mention how this is particularly important for Africa because of the huge informality and poverty incidents. So recently also they've intensified testing, and the strategy is to rapidly increase testing so that more cases can be detected, and also observe social distancing measures in line with public health requirements. In terms of the responses, most African countries had a combination of fiscal, monetary, and macro financial responses. These include increasing health spending, easing taxes, decreasing interest rates, boosting the liquidity in the economy, and also offering like a moratorium for COVID-19 related repayment difficulties. But it's important to note that the continent has very limited physical space that limits the ability to actually implement these policies up to the scale that is needed. So, as you can, from the slide, you can see that the spending plans of countries in Sub-Saharan Africa is only 0.26% of the GDP on the average. Also, there has been a huge decline in the global demand of commodities, since the pandemic, this outbreak started. And African countries, unfortunately, are very commodity export dependent, so these puts even more strain to their fiscal position and capacity to really respond to these crises. Coming down to Nigeria, Nigeria has been quite proactive in terms of responses. There's been the cash transfer to the most vulnerable households of our amount of $55. There have been, tax refund to businesses, 50%, and there's been some spending for the Center of Disease Control. And there's been fiscal stimulus. On the monetary side, as expected, they revised the interest rate downwards, to stimulate businesses, liquidity injections, and also provision of credit facilities. However, there are some existing constraints that limit the ability of these interventions to be fully effective. One is that there is a very huge unbanked population in Africa, in Nigeria.
2 minutes remaining.
Oh, wow. So there are almost about 40 million adults are financially excluded. So there is also the huge problem of informality that has really affected people during these lockdown measures. A huge percentage of the labor force in Nigeria are in the informal sector. People that earn daily income, engage in petty trade, and very uncertain income levels, very limited savings, and to the extent that the palliative measures were not up to scale to really support these people in the informal sector, the lockdown measures was very harsh and had very negative socio-economic consequences. Also, grants to the health sector, fiscal stimulus were focused to the health sector, and monies provided to households are mainly credit facilities. So there's quite some limitation to the ability, to really make these policy responses effective. So in terms of socio-economic implications, the measures put in place to combat the spread of the virus has had some implications. reduction in market access, for both commodity and non-commodity exports has had huge consequences in terms of losses of revenue. There's been widening inequalities, because a lot of businesses do not have a technology to adopt the digital technology options. The measures such as social distancing cannot really function in very dense populations. Africa has a lot of slums and places where social distancing is not practical. It's not practically applicable. So the role of South-South cooperation and triangular cooperation, one is that the South-South countries, in line with the triangular cooperation, can mobilize medical supplies and equipment to support directly from the WHO. Also, debt standstill packages will be helpful for the indebted African countries. Opening trade lines and establishing more effective supply chains can be effective. Suspending the tariffs on imports of essential COVID-19 supplies. And also, while the World Bank and IMF have moved to repose funding of over $2.3 billion, countries can still arrange bilateral funding packages, particularly to finance social safety nets for the most vulnerable. And I'll end on this note. The COVID-19 is a global public challenge, as no country is safe until all countries are safe. As such, leveraging on cooperation among countries in the global south and between countries in the global south and north is very crucial. Thank you very much for your audience.
Thank you very much, Chuka. Thank you for reminding us, actually, we have had experiences before in dealing with previous epidemics, and that knowledge still, we need to cherish that and build on that. And it's also a reminder that today our knowledge sharing will be important not only for the current situation, and we should keep documenting and researching and sharing and leave that legacy, to prepare to be more resilient. Also, you brought attention to us on the informal sector extensively, especially those at the other side of the digital divide, that we're saying that, it seems very promising that the digital transformation is happening because of COVID-19, but the reality is there is a huge divide, and there are businesses, individuals at the other end. That is an important reminder for us as well. So you're calling for South-South cooperation to focus a lot on the debt issues, promoting more trade and more effective value chain, funding for social safety net, etc. Thank you very much for this important points. And now let me have the pleasure to introduce our speaker, Mr. Balazs Havar, a senior colleague, senior economic and strategic advisor on Belt and Road Initiative, UNDP China. Balazs has recently co-authored a UNDP publication, The Social and Economic Impact of COVID-19 in Asia and Pacific region, and the recent co-ed published by the World Economic Forum on universal basic income is the answer to the inequalities exposed by COVID-19. We will be sharing the impact of COVID-19 and what it will have on the SDGs, what policies countries should consider to put in place to further mitigate the impact. Thank you. Balazs, the floor is yours.
I first have to start by unmuting. Having cleared that problem, let me thank you for inviting me. I'd like to focus on adding new elements to the discussion because there have been excellent remarks before me. So let me just say we are facing a twin globally synchronized crises. And that is, of course, the health and the economic crisis. And we need to see this through an SDG lens. And doing so will lead us to the conclusion that one of the things that this does is that inequalities are rising very rapidly. Inequalities in income, wealth, access to opportunities, inequalities along gender lines, as already mentioned before me, all of these have heightened. And Gala already noted that another cleavage is really emerging, and that is the digital divide. So those with access to internet and able to work from home have a distinct advantage. And similarly, those who can learn from home, those children have a distinct advantage. In addition to economic sustainability being at risk, so is social sustainability. If we try to address it with our existing policies without fundamentally rethink how to go about the response, then we will probably undermine economic sustainability. And while there is a co-benefit to everyone staying home, environmental sustainability is definitely not assured either. Several speakers have already noted that social safety nets are inadequate in many countries. Informality is one reason. But by and large, the problem is that hundreds of millions of the most vulnerable are not being reached. A lot of people say, oh, SDGs are now off track. And I suggest carefully thinking about the different horizons of what we are talking about now, which is the next 3 months, 6 months, or a year, how to address the twin crises, and the SDGs, which have a decade-long horizon. So I would submit to you that it's too early to call. While all SDG indicators are severely affected right now, in the long run, what will happen will primarily depend on how we respond. What are the policy choices that we make today? And let me turn to those now. Echoing Kitmina and Chuka, I would like to first set the stage by saying that we are facing a global crisis, and therefore we absolutely have to have a globally coordinated response. And we need to display global solidarity, and it's in the essential interest of everyone. And in that context, of course, there is an important role for South-South cooperation. We need to respond to the health emergency. We also need to sustain jobs and incomes for the hundreds of millions who are losing their livelihoods now. We have to mitigate the burden of care work, which mostly falls on women. In fact, some people described the current situation as a care crisis. Let me make a fundamental point. The policy response that we put forward now not only has to be globally coordinated, it also has to move away from the idea that everything we have been doing so far is brilliant and we just need to apply a patch on top of previous policies. I would emphatically like to say no. Several of the policies that we have entered the crisis with have been distinctly suboptimal. One example is fossil fuel subsidies. They are positively contrary to the climate change SDG, to attaining the climate change SDG. Globally, we have also reached an equilibrium where we have what I call, and others call, fiscal termites. They basically undermine national budgets. Let me just give you the examples of those. Tax competition, tax evasion using tax havens, transfer pricing of multinationals to shift profits to lower tax environments, and fossil fuel subsidies. Also the taxation of the digital economy. All of these represent tremendous amount of fiscal revenue to national budgets if these fiscal termites are addressed. And there is coordinated action, but for that, countries need to work together. Because if only one country tries to address these, then it will end up in a competitive disadvantage. So creating fiscal space has been mentioned already before. me, and addressing these fiscal termites is one important aspect. And it is very important to rethink current revenue policies and expenditure policies in the budget, rather than rush and say, oh, we need to raise additional debt. We need to revise what we have been doing right and what is no longer optimal given the crisis on the revenue side and similarly on the expenditure side. And then, if not enough fiscal space has been created by doing things more sensibly, then we do need to consider adding debt because the needs are very large. This is in line with what I call the rule number 1 of crisis management, and we definitely find ourselves in a crisis. That rule number 1 is when you find yourself in a crisis, in a hole, then first stop digging. So first, let's get rid of policies which do not make sense in the new environment and frankly did not make very much sense in the previous environment either. And then, once we have addressed those, then let's see what additional policies we need. Jorge already stressed the importance of debt service relief to heavily indebted countries. I fully agree with that. On the economic side, we have to sustain activity and livelihoods. And this is because, again, globally, in a globally coordinated way, because in the past 40 years, we have seen a phenomenal increase in incomes, real incomes of all countries because of globalization. And if we now are not careful and we undermine global value chains and we continue, or large countries continue with policies like increasing tariffs in an environment where the transactions costs to trade have already risen very, very fast, then unfortunately what we could see is globalization in reverse. And all the fantastic gains from trade that we have seen materialize in 40 years can actually begin to erode and melt away. And that would be a tragedy. I also think that within countries, it is critical to improve public services and enable them digitally. And those services also for business. It should not cost much to be compliant with tax and regulatory requirements.
2 minutes remaining.
Yes, and I just wanted to get to the last block of what I wanted to mention. What we have seen is a gigantic socio-economic experiment. It was not an experiment we have devised, but it has actually shown that greenhouse gas emissions can be reduced. It's not the way anyone would like to reduce them, but they can be. It is important that when we build back to a resilient and sustainable development path, because before the crisis, we have not been on a sustainable path. This will also help build trust in governments and set the stage for creating a new, just, and fair social contract. Just 2 more thoughts. Create the legal and regulatory basis for a digital economy. Invest in affordable digital connectivity for all as a new public good. I'd like to mention this and emphasize this. It is a new public good to have affordable digital access for everyone. And finally, promote low carbon, circular, and sharing economies to attain environmental sustainability, together with social and economic sustainability. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Balazs. Having been a colleague with you for so many years, it's always very rewarding to listen to your talk, and I have learned so much. Thank you very much. And it's so important that you tell us, stop digging, stop those policies that will do further harm to the world economy, and put in new policies because we are forced to have a socio-economic experiment on a gigantic scale. And now is the opportunity to do things right and to be able to recover better. And the new global public goods through digital innovation, through creating affordable access to digital transformation, I think it also pointed out a new direction that South-South cooperation should pay a lot of attention to, because the Global South is demanding for that. Thank you very much for that. Now I would like to open the floor for questions. We have already received so many comments and questions. So let me just try to highlight a few for the first round. I think we still have 25 minutes. So let's spend about 15 to 20 minutes, and then at the end we will have Stefan to give us closing remarks. So the first question is Dr. Shivam Sharma, working on model of urban health India. Dr. Sharma put forward a strong suggestion to apply multi-sectoral model based on the logic of inquiry, involving methods, tools like driving change, defining, designing, realizing, relating, and capturing success for multi-sectoral collaboration. And this is a very important approach that is recommended for the work now to enable us to develop a contingency flexi pool of bonds and policies, I guess, with shared and comparatively less risk to counter this issue. So this is a comment, but if panel have any reaction on that, please also share. We also get a question from Dr. Amina Rashid, who is also associated with our office, because vulnerabilities and inequalities seem to be very significant and disproportionately impacting people. So her question is focusing on, in the sense of class and race. They appear to be key determinant in some countries in terms of the survival rate. So she would like to know if there are similar, situation and analysis, maybe from Argentina or any other countries. Another question by Dr. Daharem Apareti. What are the positive aspects of COVID-19? If we think from positive perspective, is there a positive aspect of cleaner environment or reduced remission? I think, and there's, of course, alongside with this negative impact. And I think the panel has talked about this opportunity, this, fast forward progress and experiment. But if you would like to elaborate more, please do so. We have Dr. Sanya Yer from TISS. There seems to be patterns in cross countries. The challenge for southern countries is to address the trade-off between growth and development. Similarly to the experience in Africa, India too is looking at options of opening up from lockdown. Response of physical and financial solutions going to determine the impact of the COVID recovery. So this trade-off, how do you manage that? What are your perspectives? And also, it's pointed out that we need to collectively debate of the role of international development cooperation in defining global public goods. South-South and triangular cooperation is a crucial framework now to extend that narrative. COVID-19, I believe, has created opportunity arrive as an alternate framework of global public goods that will encompass the rights to life, rights to privacy, rights to information, rights to collective action, all these aspects. So how these will be considered in the future international development cooperation. And then we have Dr. Rio Budi from the Indonesia Permanent Mission in New York. The question is to Mr. Kismina. Considering there are boom and bust industries within the COVID-19 for developing countries, would it be possible to shift workers from bust industries to boom industries? Which are those boom industries can they join? And what policies should be in place? And how can we use South-South cooperation for this endeavor? And this is a very timely, relevant, real question, because it's being practiced, I know, in countries like, for example, China. But so any panel members would like to join Kitmina in this response, you're also welcome. Now let me stop here. We have more questions for the first round. Let me opening up for a quick response from our panelists. Can we? Who should we start? Shall we start from Kitmina? Would you be ready?
Yeah. Just to respond to the question about kind of boom and kind of the transition of laborers from one industry to the other. We are already seeing some manufacturing industries changing their production themselves from manufacturing certain goods to manufacturing, and this is particularly important in the health manufacturing sector. So they are moving towards producing things like masks. Some companies are, producing ventilators, hand sanitizer, and so on. So there is some transition that is happening within industries themselves. So companies that already have that sort of technology are changing their production processes somewhat to provide for that demand, the high demand for healthcare-based goods. Whether it's possible to transfer labor in its entirety, I'm not entirely sure. Because it depends a lot on the country's capacity. It depends a lot on the country's manufacturing base. So for example, Sri Lanka's manufacturing base is very narrow. It's kind of mainly in terms of apparel industries and some other kind of intermediate manufacturing. So in that sense, how much of it will be, the marginal impact of that will be quite low, or the marginal opportunities for that will be quite low. It's possible, but like the question, the follow-up question was in regards to South-South cooperation. So one thing would be to create the sort of supply chains within southern countries where South-South cooperation allows for the development of those supply chains. That then allows developing countries to manufacture and trade between each other. So that is a possibility. And in terms of South-South investment, there could be investment in that sense as well. So countries who are in need or who have the capacity to invest in these other developing countries in the sort of manufacturing sectors that they that are going to, their demand is going to be higher, could potentially engage in that. However, whether developing countries can change on their own, I'm not as optimistic, unfortunately, about whether that's possible.
Thank you, Kitmina. So shall we move to Gala? Would you like to address some of the questions? Okay.
Yes, thank you for all the very interesting questions. The issue, the question that was posed specifically for Argentina regarding the intersectionality in the survival rate, how inequalities tend to add on when we see who get most sick and ultimately die from COVID, aren't being seen just yet in Argentina, but I believe that's because of two reasons. Firstly, because we don't have yet very widespread testing, so we aren't yet aware of the whole of the problem. The second issue is that because we are still quite early in the development of the curve, so what we have had mostly in Argentina is people being admitted into hospitals, and those casualties we have had, which are quite few, are mostly from imported cases, people who had traveled beforehand. So they are all from higher income sectors of our society. Now the virus is starting to transit in more communitarian regions, so we will see probably later on more infections that add on these inequalities. We have already started to see in the metropolitan area of Buenos Aires, the capital of Argentina, in some particular neighborhoods that have problems in terms of access to basic services, how the contagious has been quite widespread. Two minor comments for two other questions. One regarding the positive aspects of COVID. I think I completely agree with Balas, how he posted this is truly a globalized problem, and also Kidmina and Chuka had posed that before. But I think that the way this is a global issue is making us rethink how some problems truly don't have any borders. And the way we answer to that should, I believe it's already answered in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, how we all have the same rights independently of where we live and where we work and how much we earn and what's our gender or our ethnicity. The last issue I would like to address is the trade-offs that are being posed between the economic strategy or development overall and the sanitary strategy. I think it's a political decision, and we have seen even in the Latin American context that the different leaders can make different priorities. In Brazil, we have seen how the president has prioritized the economy. In Argentina, we have seen how the president has prioritized the sanitary strategy. These aren't dichotomous. We can choose and mix it up. But I do think that for the day after, when the isolation starts to being flexibilized and more sectors are allowed to come back to economic activity, there is also a political decision in which sectors are prioritized in that strategy. And we are advising the government and trying to push for prioritizing sectors that have the largest capacity to boom once they are open, and also incorporate in that activity low income and low qualification workers, which have been the most challenged by the current crisis. And this only means to have a bottom-up responses. I think that there is a very important role of local actors and in identifying which of these sectors are in each of the provinces in Argentina, and how can we open them, being rigorous and trying to not undo everything we did with the sanitary strategy, but trying also to build the trade chains that might incorporate the most people and have the greatest impact in terms of job creation, mostly for the most vulnerable sectors. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carla. So shall we have Chuka?
Thank you. Since some of the panelists have answered most of the questions, I will concentrate on the one specific to Nigeria or Africa. So it's about formalizing the informal sector. So that is a huge problem in Africa. And experience from Nigeria, over the past 5 years, there have been some increased efforts towards bringing the informal sector into the formal sector. But that has not really been quite aggressive. This outbreak has really shown the need to make very concerted efforts towards formalization of businesses in Nigeria and Africa generally. There are issues with this formalization. So within this outbreak, the government brought about some credit facilities, some palliative measures, but a lot of the businesses that actually need these palliatives and incentives and credit facilities, the government does not have any record of them. They are not in any official database, and it is very difficult to provide these credit facilities to these businesses. So they did not benefit from this. So this is one of the benefits of formalization, so that they can have access to this kind of support from the government in times like this, and also, another disadvantage of operating informal, a lot of them have limited access to digital technologies. This is one other area that the government needs to really promote, digitalization of businesses, so that in cases like this where there is no, the option of operating, internet through digital options will be feasible, And also, formalization will also help in revenue generation. Part of what is being faced now, it's a double tragedy. African countries are facing the pandemic, the socio-economic pandemic, and also a slump in commodity prices, particularly oil. That has really worsened their fiscal position. So making efforts to formalize businesses so that you generate the revenue from them, it's also, a revenue generating option that is quite critical, when you're faced with this kind of fiscal, limited fiscal. So I think there should be a national strategy, like from Nigeria, to really, really encourage businesses to get to formalize, and this outbreak has really shown that need. So that is my contribution at this point. Thank you.
Thank you, Chuka. Balazs, can we have some remarks from you responding to any of the questions?
Sorry, was that me?
Yes, Balazs, please.
Oh, sorry. Yes. Again, lots of very smart answers have already been given. So let me just give some bullet points. Let me start by saying I fully agree with Chuka. This informal-formal divide is hugely important. And whatever we can do already in the process of addressing the current problems to actually pave the way towards a more formalized economy where everyone has access to decent jobs and to benefits with those jobs is a critical aspect of whether we come out of this well or not. There was a question which was not mentioned first, but there was a question about monetary policy. Can it stimulate the response? And the answer is, in principle, it could, but we have entered the crisis with monetary policy basically being a spent force. All the gunpowder has been used up already on monetary policy, so there isn't a whole lot it can do right now. On the other hand, on the fiscal side, let me just connect two things, which I think is very important. I've talked about the need to create fiscal space, and some elements of creating that fiscal space can actually be instrumental in helping the environmental development become far more sustainable. What I have in mind is if we eliminate fossil fuel subsidies, we impose a carbon tax, and we auction off emission permits for large emitters of greenhouse gases, we create a lot of problems, and some of the funds raised will need to be used to address those problems. But still, just by changing the relative price of carbon and fossil fuels and non-fossil fuels, renewables, we will be sending a signal which finally points in the same direction as the NDCs, the National Determined Contributions, which are quantity targets for large players. When it comes to individuals, millions and millions of individual decision makers, it's the prices that matter. So we have to set the prices right. And if we try to set the prices right through these means, we also create fiscal space. So two things are actually going to go hand in hand, and it can really help. Let me connect a bit to this labor shifting. I'd like to make a point about this crisis that we are in. It came on top of an already ongoing shift of the fourth industrial revolution and technological change, which was escalating. The speed of it was escalating. It was always going to have a huge impact on jobs. And now what we have is that this has been accelerated by the current crisis. So this means that there is going to be a whole lot of shifting just because the nature of jobs is changing. There is another element, and I think it's been already mentioned. It has to do with how supply chains have been excessively long. So supply chains will be shortened. They will be shortened. Probably some of them will become purely national supply chains. Others will be south rather than spanning the entire globe. And then, of course, there will be some for which the economic rationale is so strong that they will remain. So there will be a shakeout. Another reason for the supply chain shakeout will be that just-in-time management of resources is probably not going to work as easily as it did before. And therefore, redundancy will need to be built in to the supply chains, and that will also change those chains, and it will have impact on the labor. Let me close with one more thought, if you allow me, and that is in response to a question by Sung Yob about the role of US and China. I actually think this is a very important question. Right now, what we are facing is that there are two countries which are incredibly large, and single-handedly they can destroy the emergence of global solidarity. And single-handedly they cannot create it. Actually, both are needed, and many, many more countries are needed to have a decent level of global solidarity in response to this crisis. And just think about inventing a vaccine. If at that point you say, great, I'm going to make a whole lot of money out of this, that's not going to help the world. We already have to have a solidarity-based idea of how we are going to distribute it to everyone who needs it, regardless of whether they can pay very serious amounts of money for it. So the point is, they can single-handedly destroy solidarity, and they need to work together with a whole lot of other countries, including South-South actors, to actually make that solidarity happen. And on this rides our collective welfare. So my parting thought is that everyone compares what we have to the big sort of loss of welfare that came from the Second World War, and how after the Second World War we managed to create institutions that reflected the desire to help everyone. And there were many decades of very large increases in welfare for most of the world. And it was unfair, and there were all kinds of problems, but nevertheless, it was broadly a successful thing. And what I worry about is that instead of having a rebuilding like after the World War II, we might have one that happened after World War I, and that would be a disaster. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Balazs. Now we don't have time for answering more questions, but there are so many interesting questions online that are visible to all the panelists. And I hope that the panelists after this webinar, if you're interested to respond to any of the questions, please share your inputs with us, and we will compile that into the whole discussion. The questions related to asking from Bangladesh, do any countries have guidance for small, medium enterprises and those employ the poor, especially in the informal sector, and policies for persons with disabilities, gender-based violence. Those are very useful and asked from several colleagues. And also there's a question about the role of civil society and mutual and cooperatives, especially experiences in Argentina. There's also this question about the international cooperation. Balazs has answered one on the relationship between US and China. There are other questions about countries who may not have the capacity to support. And in this kind of situation, how do they seek collaboration? How do they manage the challenges? question from Ministry of Planning Somalia raised the question for countries in Africa that still need the first step, the most urgent needed supplies. South-South cooperation is in action, I know, in many of the countries, but this is a question to remind us that this is also needed. And we have an input from our own Africa chief about the South-South cooperation now on technical level, on economic level, but also political solidarity is very much needed on many fronts of the debate currently in the continent. So these are questions that I highlight here, but we don't have time to answer it. Let me pass on to the concluding remarks by Mr. Stanton Kingiville, the director of UNDP Seoul Policy Center.
Yeah.
Stefan, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Grace. Great. And thank you so much for this very rich webinar discussion. I think everybody is now really an expert how to run a webinar. I think that's great. Let me just give you 5 very quick takeaways I would like to highlight, and I make it really quick and quite basic. The first one is the complexity of the situation as a basic fact. I think this is what many of you were highlighting. We have those countries still in the phase of preparing for the crisis. We have those countries dealing with the immediate response, and of course, and that was the main focus, the recovery strategy, that we need to face those socioeconomic impact aspects. And you mentioned this whole list of, challenges which are relevant in this regard. Domestic work, and I think Gala, you were one great example how to manage to be a great panelist and to be also, taking care of your kid. But without any joke, we have those gender-based violence aspects, unemployment, inequalities, macroeconomic aspects. So really this long list of interrelated issues, and this is from my perspective the complexity of the situation. My second point is, of course, we have a strong need for investments. So we have a strong need for fiscal space, and many of you were mentioning it. At the same time, we have a situation where knowledge sharing and knowledge management is something what is a crucial modality of international cooperation. And I think just looking at the discussion on South-South cooperation for the last couple of years, including BAPA plus 40 last year as a highlight, this knowledge aspect as a main modality is something what was very much pushed by the South-South cooperation debate. And I think this is something what is really important. And just to give you one aspect, not really South-South cooperation related, but since our center is based in Korea, looking at the situation in Korea, and many countries are looking for a role model, Korea is now a main knowledge hub when it comes to sharing COVID-19 related knowledge. So what I want to say, this modality is very strongly related to South-South cooperation over the last couple of years. My third point, very much related to it, I think it's important to have more reflections on how to make knowledge management, knowledge sharing most effective in this regard. And I think what Balázs was saying about policy responses is related to it. What Jorge and what Grace were presenting as examples when it comes to the collection of innovative approaches. So what the UN Office for South-South Cooperation is doing, and also what we are doing as a center in Seoul, is very much about, making knowledge management more effective, more of the benefit of everybody. My fourth point is triangular cooperation. From my perspective, this is also very much about knowledge sharing and knowledge management again. But the main aspect here, and I think Jorge would agree with me, is the emphasis on multi-actor approaches. So, of course, national governments are crucial, but what we are just seeing is that in the crisis, in this COVID-19 crisis, the subnational interaction of cities, municipalities is very important. What is important is civil society organizations, private sector. I mean, private sector is really a crucial actor in this regard, and not at least academia. I mean, what countries should do in this kind of situation is that they respond in a way which is evidence-based, and evidence is coming from the academia. And if we take this kind of, combined approaches that we need to bring together those different actors, this is multi-stakeholder approaches. This is, in my translation, to a large extent, triangular cooperation. So this is something what we should develop further. My last point is a big thank you to all panelists, Gala, Kit, Nina, Chukbuva, Balash, and that was really great. The colleagues from the UN Office of South-South Cooperation, Jorge, Grace, Sham, thank you so much for this great collaboration. And I would also like to thank my colleagues Artemi and Yasmin. That was a great collaboration. I think we had close to 200 participants. We saw in the chat function that many comments and questions came in. This is also something what is a strong indicator that this webinar was very successful. Let's try to reflect over the next couple of days how we can push forward this kind of discussion. I would really like to thank everybody, panelists, moderator, participants, for this rich webinar. Wish you good night in East Asia, great day in the United States, and nice afternoon in Europe and Africa, and hope to see you soon again, and all the best to you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much, Stephanie. Thank you, Grace. Thank you, Stefan, for your leadership support.
Thank you,
you have had such a wonderful webinar. You have to have a 1-minute commercial. So we welcome all the participants to the next webinars that we will be organizing. The following 4 webinars. One is on the role of digital innovation during the COVID-19 pandemic. The next one on spotlighting women's leadership in the response to COVID-19. And the following one, we will organize a joint webinar with WFP on experiences on social protection and South-South cooperation in the COVID-19 pandemic. And the last one, online consultation with UNDP's Human Development Report Office on their upcoming HDR on sustainable human development pathways, and also in the context of COVID-19. Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye-bye.